Yes. All right, welcome everyone at the next Multi-Network Community Sync. Today is February 14th. Happy Valentine to everyone. And let's kick this off. So first thing, let's talk about the tomorrow's meeting. So tomorrow, I put a agenda item to the SIG networking to discuss the current approach, and I'm gonna kind of give you what my goal there is. As we discussed since end of the last year, there were voices about multi-network being too complex. In this kind of concerns, what we did, we kind of limited some of the requirements / use cases that we had initially in our CAP. Namely, we kind of disconnected ourselves from DRA. That was one of the main kind of concerns. So we simplified some of the use cases. And now I think what it boils down to is we have the complexity of a feature. Basically, it's not heavy, it's not big, but in our approach, we want to make sure network is a built-in construct of the Kubernetes, which introduces a moderate or maybe some level of complexity into the whole system as Kubernetes. And this is what we need to discuss tomorrow, whether that's acceptable or not. And first stage, I assume we need to kind of convince the SIG networking that's the case, and see where that goes, right? And one more argument why we even went for that kind of approach, and main reason for that approach is user experience. As we know today, and Doug, correct me if I'm wrong, since 2019, how long Multus is around?
I technically longer than that. That's probably like around when things started to stabilize, but yeah, since 2017.
17. Okay, so we have like already 7 years of user experience where we have to go through annotations, right? And we just want to evolve that to something concrete and better, right? And the only way, unfortunately, to do that, how we currently know and see in core, is to add fields to the pod spec and make the object some sort of network object reference in the core, right? That's how we currently see. This is the current only available options for us to do. And basically, this is what I'm gonna bring up tomorrow. This is my reasoning. Correct me if I'm wrong. Are there any other arguments for us to go built in? If you see any, if you have any other comments, let me know. Anyone?
I mean, I'm thinking about it. Well, at least for me, and I don't know that this is an argument for or against built-in object, but so for me, part of the reason to participate in this effort, I guess it sort of links to the services discussion, is that I want to be able to solve some problems that are more difficult to solve when it's like an entirely out of tree solution, right? So there's part of me that says it's a technical detail if it's built in or not, but we need something to hang our hat on in order to assert the other changes that we might need to make, like related to services or network policy, etc. Mike, go ahead.
I wanted to disambiguate built-in object for a second. Is that native object, or does that mean something different?
Say again. Is that what?
What do we
Native.
mean? Okay,
Oh.
native object. Can we say native object? I think more people understand that better. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's perfect. Thanks for the feedback. No, that's fair. Yeah, let's. I'm call that built-in. I can give an example like a pod deployment. Those are I'm considered those are built-in objects, right? And then native meaning like a first citizen object. Yeah, that's something that we don't have today. Network like for example, the storage or node has no representation in Kubernetes APIs at all, right? And it was by design initially, but we see use cases to expand that and do some to expand that, right? And we do it in a means that, of course, manageable, right? So that's what I meant by that, Michael. I'm not sure. Yeah, is there any other ways? What would you kind of consider? Because that's a good kind of point. Is there any? Are you considering some of the objects inside core something else? You divide them in some other ways, or?
I believe there is actual like verbiage around what some of these objects are called.
Got it.
I don't remember, like there's certain like ones under the covers, like the Kubernetes something object or something. I could dig it up. But yeah, I think
Okay,
native,
gotcha.
it just sounds more idiomatic versus
Okay,
built.
fair. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair point. Yeah, that's that.
Sorry
And
for
yeah, go ahead.
sorry, Mate. For illiterators like me, can we deambiguate native and core as well? Is that the same thing?
I would say yeah.
Okay.
To be honest, for all these comments, the thing here is it's not a CRD. Okay, that's the difference. Okay, that I think that's kind of straightforward. CRD has a definition, and it's an external object, a extension, right? So maybe that will be the definitive, like not a CRD, right? That's what I mean by built-in. When basically neither of the pod, you cannot see a CRD for a pod deployment, a node. You don't have that for any of those built-in objects. That's how I'm calling it, right? Exactly. So that's did I hit the nail with the non-CRD, Jaime? I think that's yeah. Okay, thanks.
I
Any
wrote
other?
it. I wrote it in the. I changed the agenda item to read "Go No Go discussion for built-in / core
Yes.
/ native object" as opposed to a CRD.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, let's probably I can update that. To be honest with you, in a SIG networking, I said multi-networking go no go, and that's for a reason, because if we cannot be built-in object, we are just going to be a side CRD that we barely care what SIG network tell us. We are community. We just okay. They will let us, and I would be appreciating if they would let us just be in the K organization. And beside that, since we don't touch the core, we don't really need to care much about them. If that will be there, that's why I say the whole thing is a no-go for the core, right? That's why I'm calling multi-networking. In our here, it's I agree with you. For us, we can pursue further on CRD, but then we have to make some demands from the core to allow us to kind of be the user experience the way we want it, right? So that's another aspect, right? Where if there will be push towards okay, go CRD, then my push will be on give us means and tools to be a CRD and not use annotations, because we already do that for 7 years with Multus, and we already have that. We want to do more. We want to have a means to properly be a kind of add-on like Gateway. Gateway doesn't need any annotations on anything to function. So that's not a solution, right? So if they tell us to do the gateway route, the complexity between us and gateway is completely of different level, right? They just apply something to existing pods. We change the core of the pod, right? So that's the big difference. So yeah, so that's going to be another arguments around this one to go with that. And yeah, the whole discussion we last SIG networking, and to kind of, I'm not sure how many of you attended last SIG networking meeting. Antonio brought up the feature creep in Kubernetes, which is concerning because folks add feature flags and don't finish the features, right? So that's one concern that we have to handle, right? So this is another aspect of this whole thing that yeah, what to do about that, right? So that as well goes to on how we develop things, how we commit things into Kubernetes. So maybe things has to be more modular than they are now, so that if anything they can easily pull it away. But that's another aspects of this whole thing that that we have to be aware of. And I welcome everyone to join tomorrow in, so that we can all kind of I don't want to be the only voice on this. I would appreciate like everyone chipping in and giving their voice around this one, right? That yes, we need it. There are use cases, and wherever you think, of course, I don't want to put my words to your mouths, but please join tomorrow to the discussion and be vocal of why we want to have this whole thing. Doug?
Thanks. Yeah, well, one thing I think from an approach method here is something that we've kind of brought up a number of times in this group is that starting with CRDs is probably a good place to start. Because we can give the like demonstration of how things work in such a way that might be able to demonstrate like these changes aren't as like huge as people might think, or that they're like a maintenance burden, for example. I think that might help because I feel like it is sort of you wind up getting the hand waving when you're saying like, hey, we're adding a new object and we're changing the pod object. And here's like a lot of material that we have behind this. Like we've had a lot of conversation. There's a lot of material. There's a lot to read through. There are like use cases from like all over the place. Like it's a lot to digest. And there's part of me that is like, if we can get down to the like nittier, grittier technical side of what we're doing, it could be a better example for people. I think what is gonna wind up, my guess as what's gonna happen in an audience like tomorrow, I think that people are gonna go, oh, there's an option to have this not built in, then don't have it built in, right?
No, but I don't want to bring it up. There is an option, right? I would never bring this up. If someone gonna have such idea that we can do a CRD, then I will push back and say, but because otherwise I would never say. I'm just bringing this up because there were some arguments where I heard that, yeah, maybe you can go CRD, and I think there was even comments on some places here even. But I say there is no way. Are you saying that that's acceptable? Because basically, if we are going to do a CRD and build it around annotations, I don't see really the for my team and for us, I don't see the any, what I want to say, attraction for this. That's my voice. We already have Multus. We already have Multus. We have some other implementation that use annotations. I don't need to build another one that's gonna just based on annotation DAG. That's at least my approach. That's my thinking.
I mean, I tend to agree with you, right? Especially as somebody that
Yeah.
this maintainer, right? So I also have this viewpoint of it, like what value am I getting out of this? And I do think that more intuitive usage is part of it. And I think that will be good, and having them in core, I think, will help with that as well.
And
yeah.
Doug, and to answer your suggestion that let's do an example that uses annotation. You're already doing the example for 7 years, Doug, with Multus.
Okay, well,
and with CRD and everything. So basically, I would say we already have that. Nathan, you have a hand. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, it was just to plus one this. I think also CRD is good for POC. So specifically for this cap, it can be a POC, but definitely if it's not part of core, the value is probably going to be diminished. at least from the perspective of all use cases.
Yeah.
So definitely agree with the fact that agreed. It's quite Multos is quite an example of a really
Of
successful
that effort,
POC.
right?
Yeah,
So
definitely.
if someone's gonna tell me go and try a CRD, we already did it. We already have it. We already have a Multus that does it from 2017. We learned so much out of it. We know what are the kind of cruxes, some race conditions, what's not. We know what it means. We have a pods with multi-homing. We know what does that mean, and basically what we have to deal with when that is the case. We have all that know-how. Now we want to do it and make it more core, right? That's the whole allude of this effort. At least that's in my opinion. That's what I'm hoping it's for most of you as well. Yeah, thanks Nathan as well. Any other comments on this?
And I just want to clarify that I am definitely for having it in core, and that I
Yeah,
am
okay.
saying that it's a potential tool in the toolbox to work with to gain consensus.
I
So
am
yeah, but I also totally agree that we do have an existing example that's been there for a long time, and maybe it is good to point at that and say, we have this, we know the limitations of it, and we
Yes.
need a core object. And I think that we need to also be transparent that we
yeah.
want to make this work end to end, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Sweet. Oh, we're aligned. I just want to let people know I don't
Sure.
disagree with having it.
So
I'm
the
good.
CR, I just brought up the CRD approach just to let you know what is my thought process around that, so that you're all aware, right? I consider CRD approach as an example we already have, but if we were to have that, then we need to have a means to properly do it in the core and integrate with the core, not using annotations. What can you deliver me around that? And if you cannot not do nothing, then basically we don't have any point of pursuing this further on, because we already have other approaches with using annotations, right? That's not the point of this effort. So that's that's my thought process on this. Any other comments? If not, I think we can switch gears to the services and start discussing some of those.
Sorry, one thing about the doing stuff with
Yeah, go ahead.
CRDs. I mean, I think I agree with everything everybody said. My only thought is, do we have a clear statement of why it's better to do stuff in core? And I think we probably all agree on it. You can get there's potential enhancements in future, there's usability and so on. Do we have that written down, something where we can say this is why we want to move it into core?
I think this is what I mentioned in the beginning, Pete. I would say user experience. That's the only, and I consider that's the only argument that I want to say and call out. Having a configuration of networking done on annotation, which can be modified at any point of the pod, and not having a proper life cycle of a pod, is not a great user experience. You cannot build any user experience around it, or you have to go around all the hoops, do everything like mutating and validating webhooks to deal with that. So I think that's the one argument why we would want to have it built in. Or and basically this is, I have to have a means that to not use annotations and have a very explicit declarative ways to define what networks I attach to. That's my that's the point of this. Do you think that's not enough, or do you see other arguments?
I think so. If user is defined broadly enough, so it's not just ordinary users who are creating pods, but also users setting up clusters and managing them and thinking about how to manage them. It will make everything easier for everybody in that.
Yeah.
There is another thing which it is potentially dangerous to mention, which is feature extensibility. So, for example, if we might start thinking about services with multi-networks and so on, that's a dangerous thing to say, because that might just lead to
no, I don't want
so
to. Yeah, because that's a Pandora
yeah.
box. Yes.
Yeah,
I don't want to
absolutely.
go there, and that's even here in my agenda. I'm calling out services in parentheses, because we know that we will not be able to expand services, right? So I would not call out tomorrow, and I don't want to call out integration with other objects, right? It's like network policies, probably we could integrate with those, but services no, because we have gateway to do that for us, right? So basically, that's my thought process. But I think, do you find any of you in the meeting find any other real argument or other concrete argument beside the user experience for having this built in? Anyone has some thoughts? All right, so I was on the spot kind of with that one. So okay, thanks. Any other comments? Pete, I think I addressed right your concern on this one, right? I think this one argument is the thing that we want to kind of address. Or do you think that's not sufficient?
Yeah, I think we should see what people say,
Yeah,
and see
okay.
what the pushback we get from that is. But yeah,
Okay,
I agree.
that's fair. Yeah, exactly. All right. So I can give you a rundown on some of the discussion that we had internally on the multi-network services, and based on our use cases that we listed on our CAP, they're basically, you can kind of put it down to 2 use cases when you have and deal with pods, right? One use case when you are multi-homing, so basically you have multiple networks connected to a single pod. And the other use case is when you apply and want to and deal with multi-tenancy. So this is one of the use case where a pod connects just to one network, but it can be any network. So basically imagine your multi-tenancy basically, right? So those are the 2 main use cases that you can think of. I don't want to go into the things that are like hardware-based stuff, SRLV or what's not. I would consider those very tricky to implement. So I would say those hardware things would not have any of the services supported. I think that's what I would think. Or you can eventually have it, but you probably have to have some SmartNIC or something to deal with that, which is an overkill probably. But if you were to have just single, let's say VIET or MAC VLAN, let's say MAC VLAN based interfaces across the board, so that it boils down to 2 use cases. You either multi-home, or you just have single interface with but connected to different networks. And why is the difference? The difference is being that basically those are 2 use cases you have to deal with. For single interface is kind of straightforward, because inside the pod you have one single default gateway, one DNS, one service sider that you have to deal with for that particular network you're in. What does that mean is, in that network, you have to have all the features that your service would expect. And that's what I just listed. Service sider, DNS, and then just connectivity for that, right? Not sure you're aware, for service sider, Antonio is working and adding something like service sider object. There is something like that. And I was hoping that could be multiplied per network. So I can create a service sider per each network, and each network would have then its own service sider. That's how I was thinking of how we could handle the service siders IPs. And then DNS, this is where, as I mentioned, is tricky. For the multi-tenancy use case, that one is kind of straightforward, because the easiest way what you could do is just create a DNS, a kube DNS on every network that you run. And easy, right? And just make sure that since you have separate service siders in each of the networks, your point 10 by default, you create a service pointing to that DNS, and you replicate the same thing multiple times. Straightforward, no rocket science. The thing here is you multiply DNS across how many networks you have. So you would have to do something about that in your orchestration. So that's the multi-tenant use case. The multi-homing use case pod is much more complex, because you have to make some rules and some limitations. Because if you have 2 or 3 networks connected to your pods that can do the whole thing for you, so all can have services, all can have DNS, all will have service siders. Basically, you can do services and all those things on each of the interfaces. But inside the pod, you have only one default gateway. So now you have to be creative. Either you do some VRFs, which is might be an overkill, but that might be a very opinionated way to do it, and your user of the pod might not like it. They may have something else. So that's approach on depending on the orchestration, how they will handle the routes inside the pod. So that's one aspect of the whole thing. The other aspect is DNS. You can have only one DNS address for the whole pod. Even if you have a free networks right inside the pod, you can have only one DNS server that you can reach out to for the name. And what then? Because if you were to just apply, let me finish my thought process, Per, and then I will give you voice. If you were to apply the first multi-tenant approach and keep DNS per each network, you would not be able to resolve a service on the other networks that, let's say, are not default gateway, right? Because your DNS will point to, let's say, the default gateway interface, right? And that DNS will know only of the services in that network. So what to do with the other ones? So this is the trade-off and something that has to be thought of to how to solve that. Go ahead, Per.
Yeah, so as soon as you have multi-networking, right, you have more than the default route. I mean, you always have if it's a subnet, you have a route for that interface and so on. So I would say that when you start adding networks, there are automatically new routes added, and the user has no control of it. He just lives with it. I have a really hard time to see how you do this without VRFs. And if sort of the network provider wants to use VRFs, why would the user be so not wanting it? You mentioned DNS, and DNS and VRFs can be problematic since you typically don't call the DNS server yourself with sort of an IP. So you use a library for the name resolution, and that's not tied to a VRF. You have no clue really which well, you do know, but I mean it will always be the default routing table that will be used for the DNS lookup. Whereas if you have name and then you have VRFs, you might want to do that in sort of based on that routing table, talk to another DNS server. But multi-homing and the sort of, except in extremely controlled environments with just one routing table is I have never seen it work.
And Per, that's exactly what I'm saying, right? Because that boils down to how how you want to configure that, and I think that boils down to the operator and owner of the platform. And basically, this is where we just need to provide the tools to.
No, I sort of agree with you there. I think the user will have to trust the network's implementations, because the user is not the one. He will select to use a network, right? A network implementation to get communication, and with that comes certain settings and constructs, right? I mean, how you connect the pod up to whatever it is a VET interface, or is it the tunnel? I mean, what is ETH interface, ETH0 interface? That's not clear, right? You just know you have an interface, and you don't really care about what the plumbing underneath is.
Yeah, exactly. Do we agree on those two core use cases? Any other cases that you can think of? So there's that aspect. So now moving to the gateway itself. Basically, gateway, I think this is something that you brought up, Doug, and this is something that I am again aware of because I dealt with it a bit. So there are two core components that you have, and then the last one is a custom route object, right? So the two core components are the class and thus the gateway. The class defines it's just other ways to differentiate type of gateways through another object, and that class can have some additional parameters or what's not. But instead of having inside the gateway object field stating like we had provider, we have in our network object we set provider. Instead of that, you could say what class of a network are you, and then instead of the provider, you would have another object called gateway class that will say I am gateway class of Multus, I am gateway class of some other CDU implementation, right? So because that was proposed to do something similar here, but I think that was a bit of an overkill for network to go that route, so we didn't go with that. But that's one gist of the gateway versus one of the kind of core gateway and gateway class. And then gateway itself by default will have IPs that you define to it. So basically a group of IPs that gateway holds and owns. And then it has a means to your controller can then say, okay, I configured those IPs, or I prepared those IPs for you. They are ready to use. And this is, you have some conditions to kind of indicate what you applied or not. And this is, for example, like in cloud, if I create a gateway with IP A, when you create that IP, I can prepare that IP for you in the cloud. That was the kind of one of the reasons I think for this. And this can be as well applied to not on-premise environments as well, where a gateway with an IP, you can prepare your switch or open your firewalls to allow this IP to come into this cluster, because there is a gateway, accepted gateway with that IP. All right, so that's what gateway is all about, holding the IPs that you are willing to use. And then what you do, you create those route objects, and there are various ones, and the one that all are using is the HTTPS route, which, because this was mainly created for L7 ingress. So you create an L7 route object that then says inside it, in the route objects, what it will usually have, and this is where usually this is all based on the route object is completely custom. So this is where you go crazy, and they want the gateway API folks are standardizing the objects, right? There is a TCP UDP route, there's HTTP route, HTTPS, if I'm not mistaken. There might be probably other ones, right? And those are somehow standardized so that across vendors they are kind of similar. But if I'm not mistaken, either one of the objects have a reference to params, so you can additionally parameterize the thing to give some flavor for your vendor specific flavors, and those are defined in the class or in the route. I don't remember that. I'm trying to Google that. But basically then you have the route. The route will always point to a gateway, so basically it will say, okay, I am using the IPs of that gateway. And then inside the route, I would say I want to apply that route to specific pods. All right, and you provide usually, I think today what is being used is just explicit service, because they don't want to implement the service. They just still under the hood points to a specific service. So this route will use service A, and service A points to some set of pods, right? And basically that's how they create the ingress object, kind of replace the ingress object for L7. And now think of it as, how would you now construct the whole thing for, let's say, TCP route, right? Similar thing, right? But we want to, in this case, we want to replace service. So instead of pointing in the TCP route object to a service, you would just put the labeling mechanism into that object and basically replace the selector capability of service and put it in the TCP route. That's basically how would you replace TCP. How would you replace the service itself. I think that's kind of the gist of it. High level, there are probably some details. Like one of the details is gateway has capability of giving permissions on can I refer you or not. and there are some rules onto that. I think that's done through listeners. So there is some sort of a access control. Who can reference me in the gateway, right? So that's one aspect. And then beside that, the gateway itself, the route themselves, basically sky's the limit. Those can be even CRDs, your custom stuff. You can just create a gateway, use that capability, and then the route can be what's not, wherever you wish for it to be. And for multi-networking, when I was looking at it, there needs to be a discussion on which aspect of those three, route, gate, or the two, route or gateway, which one would be per network, right? And this is where logically you would think, can I have IPs in that can apply to multiple networks, or the IPs are within a specific network only, right? When you think a gateway. So maybe then the network reference would be in the gateway object, not in the routes, right? So that kind of things that has to be thought of, because you probably shouldn't have capability of having gateway in network A and route in network B, right? You don't want to do that, because that's that can be tricky if you were to allow this, because now you're kind of enabling routing between a real routing, L3 routing, probably, depending on what your network is, but then cross communication between. So that's kind of gets sticky, and that's another Pandora box about this. So definitely I would just keep it simple for this discussion here, where you would only allow a gateway and a route within the network. Then it's very simple. It's exactly the same thing. You don't have to worry about cross networking. How would that behave? What are the use cases? What are the kind of corner cases about this? But basically that's the gist of it. Did that kind of cleared a bit about the gateways and routes? And I assume
Yeah, thanks for the walkthrough. That explains it a lot better. Thanks.
yeah, and basically that's the other thing about the gateway was to create. Oh, I have this picture. Share this up. This is from the Gateway API official site, right? Where then you can split the responsibilities of who does what, right? You can have gateway class can be created by your infrastructure provider, because you define, as the owner of the platform, you define what sort of versions of that gateway you allow in your cluster, right? And basically sky's the limit. It doesn't have to be only ingress. You can create your own class that does something completely different, and those are just new classes, right? And then your routes can only work with those specific classes. You can do that, right? So basically there is that aspect. Then the gateway itself is being created by the cluster operator, someone who created and administrates the cluster itself, but it's not an infrastructure provider. And then there are the user application, who then someone created the IPs for me already, and in this cluster I can use only those, and then I can reference those and to ensure that traffic goes into and is being ingressed into my service and my pods, right? So that's basically the reason they did this split was mainly to have those roles separated and splitted, so that everyone can create whatever they can, right? So in let's say if we were to do something similar for network, a provider could say, okay, in this cluster I can have only Multus class and some default class, right? And you can only create networks from those two classes. That's kind of the analogy I can make around this one. And for multi-networking, we definitely would want to have one of those aspects. I think gateway or the routes in the specific assigned to a specific network. Of course, we don't want to have services, because services don't have an aspect of that. So those would have to be able to backend based on labels or something. And then point to the proper endpoints in the specific network, right? And there is that other aspect that I think you already brought up last week, I saw that someone mentioned that there was a concept of let me maybe share this back. There was a concept of by Tomo from Multus to kind of do something about giving a service a managed by label, right? Keep in mind that's something that last year I did for endpoint slice controller. Endpoint slice controller is the other aspect that basically servers rely on heavily. And right now, endpoint slice controller is a library which you can pull and set your own managed by. So you can create your endpoint slice controller. The problem with that one is just half of the work that's needed for the whole thing, because what Tomo started here is needed as well to, if you really want to have your services and being handled by just you. And this is to the case if we want to use services object, right, for the aspect of multi-networking, or even just today, if I were to do some sort of annotation-based approach, right? Let's say I would put annotation of my network in the service. Today, you cannot do that, because if you put annotation on a service, that service will be understood by the existing controllers and it will be reacted on. Cluster IP will be assigned, endpoints will be detected, and basically the endpoints will be wrong because it will be in the wrong network that you would think this service is for, and all that, right? So I think that was one step that we could do that would give at least temporary solution until we sort out the gateway stuff, right? That's something that that I want to point out, that that's kind of possibilities to do as well.
Yeah, there is a part of me that wouldn't mind trying to follow up on that work, because at least to me, it doesn't seem like it's a huge
No, it's
sweeping
not.
change, and it follows a model that we have, right?
Right. So the one thing I talk about this one, I think one thing that Tomo was missing is cap. I think the change is there. You would have to write down a cap stating, I want to introduce managed by to a service, right? And then if if the managed by is not is I would imagine the cap would say that if the managed by is not there, or the managed by equals some specific built-in value, then it's managed by the internal. But if there is a managed by, but the value equals something completely else, I don't touch that service, right?
Yeah.
And then you have full free reign to do whatever you want, right? You can create your own controller that will then handle that and do the whole thing that you need. Will assign IPs, will do what's not. You can then create the endpoint slice controller that will properly discover, and you have to kind of create your own endpoint slice controller that will be able to discover the endpoints in that specific network that you support. So yeah, you then have all the means to do your own the controllers on the side on your before multi-networking for those with that kind of approach. Yes.
Hey, Mache, when you did the changes for endpoint slice controller, did you also have a cap for that?
Yes.
All right. Is there any chance that you could grab it for me as a reference?
Yeah. Let me
Because
try
I feel
to.
like that could be a really good model for this set of changes too.
Let me try to find that for you. But yes, I will try to find it. And
You don't have to find it right now.
Mhm.
And I can also go look too. So
Mhm.
yeah, thank you regardless.
Any other discussion? I think around this one, endpoint slide. Yeah, the gateway is a means to kind of, so what you're saying and pursuing that managed by, that's kind of I would consider that as a something that we can do in a quarter and have it done by end of next release. And 131, I assume we could have that, right? I don't think this has to be alpha beta, because this is just a simple understanding of all the controllers, understanding them managed by, right? And then then we can kind of build, all of us can start building something out of that, and that's not kind of interfere, and nothing will from the core will interfere whatever you want to do. That's one step. But long term, if you were to able to do network as a core, I would say gateway API is the way to go, and to enhance that gateway class, gateway and routes to do that. The one aspect of this is cluster IP. And with cluster IP, we have to be able to disconnect the today's service sider from the core, because we add the object, but basically I recently learned how convoluted the IP reservation for cluster IP is, and it's crazy. And basically, if we want to go the gateway route, we have to make sure we disconnect that part from the core, because then the same cluster IP has to be as well assigned to the cluster IP type routes in the gateway, right? So there is that aspect of this whole thing, that we need to be able to support the cluster IPs on services and on any custom routes that we would have. Maybe not custom, but at least the TCP and UDP routes, because we have to support cluster IP on this one, right? If we want to support multi-network, I would say a aspect is of having multi-tenancy and multi-homing pods, but then I would consider to have fully fledged features. I want to have load balancer type services. I want to have cluster IP type services. I want to have all those capabilities. However, I will do my multi-homing, which is a problem, but that's, I think, something that has to be resolved by the platform itself. I don't think that can be solved by core Kubernetes. And then multi-tenancy, that's something that basically I'm kind of alluding towards, where every pod can have just one interface connected to different networks. So each network has to have its own service sider, endpoint slices, and then means to be able to point service to it, right? And that will be the gateway, right? And I should be able to do any type of service, and that has to be cluster IP or a load balancer type, right? Or node port for the matter, if anyone is still using that one. But basically, the two first one are very important, and then DNS has to work. So basically, the routes, the TCP route name has to be properly resolvable, same way the service is today. So all that kind of things has to be there, and then we have to properly disconnect some of those kind of concepts to support with the multi-tenancy, right? To work with the TCP route or UDP route. And of course, that leads as well to other features that service doesn't have, like, for example, L3 route, right? I want to apply something that there was a cap back in the days, just kind of bring this up. All ports, there was a notion of all port service. So I want to have all the ports routed to that pod, right? I don't want to be on specific port, which today's a load balancer type LB is always L4 layer 4. I don't want to do that. I want to L3. I want all this IP, all the packets for that IP going to this pod, right? Why not, right? So you can have then with routes, you can create your L3 route object that does that, right? And basically then you have even more capability. So that's why gateways, everyone is so attracted to gateway, because you can kind of go crazy with some of the capabilities, right? But of course requires the lower layer stuff requires some changes in the core so that it could be done, right? But throwing that in. Any other questions or comments on this? I think we're out of time. Any other topics? All right, folks. So I hopefully gonna see most of you tomorrow at the SIG networking, and we can kind of have a constructive discussion on this built-in aspect in the core. All right.
Sounds good.
Hopefully,
Catch you tomorrow.
yeah. Catch you tomorrow as well. Bye.
Bye.